Hello, and welcome to the Prime Reckoning, a channel for women over 50. I'm Julie, and on this channel, we talk about topics that are important to women who are finding themselves in the later parts of their lives. So, today we have a little bit of a disturbing topic. Ladies, if you are in a vehicle with a man, and your vehicle gets into an accident, are you more likely to be hurt or mortally wounded? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. And we're going to talk a little bit today about why that is. We're going to look at some crash statistics, and then we're also going to look at some legislation regarding these issues. So let's take a look at our first article here. Roll back up to the top. So this is an article from the New York Times. It was written by one of their women's writers, titled Crash Test Dummies Made Cars Safer for Average Size Men. This is the author, Alicia Gupta. We're going to go with that if you want to look her up. So the article starts out, today, if a woman in the United States gets into the driver's seat of most cars, she is 73% more likely than a male driver to be severely injured if the car crashes. She is also 17% more likely to have fatal injuries. Fatality and injury risks are also higher for older adults, heavier adults, and children than it is for young to middle-aged men who weigh around 170 pounds. These figures are not new. Lawmakers, automakers, safety advocates, and researchers have known of these discrepancies for almost a decade at least. In 2013, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration analyzed 50 years of crash data and came to these conclusions. And much of those gaps in safety can be linked to a vehicle's design and technology, the report stated. In other words, many cars are less safe for women and people of certain sizes and ages because they are built that way. Designers and researchers are, however, trying to leverage cutting-edge technology to create a more standardized bottom line for safety in future car designs. The research very much at this stage is about the diversity of body shapes, said a technical specialist for injury prevention at Volvo. Mandates for safety features in cars started in the 60s and 70s, much to the chagrin of most automakers. Before then, most cars had little to no protection for drivers and passengers. There were no seatbelts and no airbags. Steering wheels could impale the driver. Flimsy doors could pop open in a crash, and unsophisticated brakes made it difficult for drivers to safely avoid a crash. As a result, between 1965 and 1973, roughly 50,000 people were receiving fatal injuries in car crashes every year. In November of 1965, the activist and lawyer Ralph Nader published his book, Unsafe at Any Speed: The Designed-In Dangers of the American Automobile, a groundbreaking expose of how car manufacturers were ignoring warnings from their safety engineers and prioritizing style over safety. It set off such widespread public outcry that in less than a year, Congress passed 2 auto safety laws that put federal safety standards into effect and eventually led to the creation of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in 1970. It was in this era of heightened scrutiny of automakers that federal agencies mandated crash tests for cars. The modern crash test dummy came around in the late 70s and early 80s. The first test dummy was known as the Hybrid 3 and was designed around the average size of a man from that period. and other sizes of the dummy were developed by either scaling up or scaling down that prototype. A female version, for example, was really just a slightly modified male. As a result, car safety features that have been introduced in the last 5 decades, from seat belts to airbags to the size of the dashboard, have largely been based on the average 1970s man. But women have different muscle mass and skeletal structure and therefore not only sit differently in cars, scooting up closer to the front in order to reach the brakes, for example, but are also injured differently. According to Caroline Perez, author of Invisible Woman: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. That includes suffering from more whiplash injury than men because the muscular composition of their necks. It is precisely because of the increased risk of whiplash injury in women that Volvo in 1998 introduced a seat that automatically absorbs most of the energy from a rear end collision. In 2011, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration updated its star rating system to include tests with female crash dummies, but there was a catch. Most of these tests required the female dummy to be tested in the passenger seat, a decision that stems from the 1950s viewpoint that a woman's either going to be in the passenger seat or in the back seat. Even though in 2019, more than half of licensed drivers in America were women. So as we can see, this is definitely a problem. We've got several problems piling up on top of each other here. The other gaping blind spot with the current crash testing system is that though most automakers continue to use the Hybrid 3 dummies, average body sizes have evolved, with the percentage of overweight and obese drivers increasing since the 70s. If you have a BMI of 30 or more, you're 80% more likely to die in a crash. It goes back to the fact that the restraint systems are not designed for somebody who's larger. The multi-layered solution to all of these problems, safety advocates say, involves newer dummies, virtual testing capabilities, and sharper regulation. Researchers, for example, have developed a new generation of dummies currently manufactured by Humanetics that are more representative of average people, a process that has taken over a decade of testing and costing tens of millions of dollars. Compared to the Hybrid 3, the new dummies also have more sensors built in to pick up on different kinds of injuries. Another system does not involve physical dummies at all. The University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute, which has been collecting data on human sizes and crash tests since the 1970s and 80s, is one of a handful of research institutions around the world that have developed a virtual testing system that in the last few years has been adopted by car companies. The system, often used early in the design process, long before a car gets to the physical test, creates computer-generated human models with skeletons and muscles that can be morphed for different ages and sizes. The tool can be expanded to allow car makers to test on subsets of different ages, sizes, and genders. You're not restricted by the design of the physical dummies. You can kind of replicate real fingers and so on. From that, we get more detailed responses, said Dr. Jacobson, adding that Volvo has developed its own similar tool in partnership with Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. The more accurate data from these tests would in turn help automakers design elements for the different body types, like completely customizable seatbelts or airbag systems. None of these innovations, however, are cheap to adopt or mandated, and activists and lawmakers are pushing for regulatory change. Like I said, we're going to go into more depth in that in a little bit. In January, the Center for Study of Responsive Law released a report to mark the 55th anniversary of Mr. Nader's seminal book with suggestions to update current testing standards and regulations. One proposal would create a separate rating system altogether that would apply female injury criteria to the dummy test results. And in July, bipartisan bills were introduced in the House and the Senate that would investigate the gaps in federal tests and standards. So let's move on and take a look at a couple of these. Okay, so let's take a look at this study that was published by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, titled Injury Vulnerability and Effectiveness of Occupant Protection Technologies for Older Occupants and Women. So this is an extensive study. As you can see, these are the contents. Everything is broken down by age and gender, but I'm just going to go over the executive summary with you today. But I will link this below if you're interested in reading the entire study. Older occupants have much higher injury and fatality risk in crashes than young adults. That has long been evident to crash investigators, data analysts, and medical personnel who treat the victims. As people age, they become more fragile, more susceptible to injury given similar physical insults or impacts. Later on, they also become frailer, more likely to perish given the same injury. The analysis of this report will show that occupants' fatality risk given similar physical impacts grows by 3% or slightly more for each year that they get older, starting at about 21. The analyses will also demonstrate that young adult women up to the age of approximately 35 have a 25 to 30% higher fatality risk given similar physical insults than men of the same age. Men's advantage, however, diminishes after age 35. By age 70, female and male drivers are about equally at risk. Evidently, young women are more fragile than young men, but eventually men's fragility catches up and/or men become frail sooner than women, as evidenced by men's lower life expectancy. The increased risk for older occupants and women may to a large extent be a consequence of intrinsic human anatomy and physiology. But a vehicle's design and technology and the crash environment could also be influential. Specifically, safety technology that is even more effective for the elderly and women than it is for young males would shrink the relative risk increase for older occupants and women. However, another technology that is especially effective for young males would tend to augment the risk disparity, even if it is also effective to some extent for the older or female occupants, but just not as effective as for young males. The report includes many estimates of the fatality or injury risk increase for aging a year or the risk for a female relative to a male of the same age, given similar physical insults by vehicle type, model year, seat position, types of occupant protection available, belt use, impact location, body region of the injury, or severity of the injury. In addition, for the major occupant protection technologies such as seat belts, airbags, and energy-absorbing materials, analysis methods of past evaluations will show if fatality-inducing effectiveness is significantly different for younger and older occupants or for men and women. Finally, the report identifies specific injuries and injury sources that are prevalent among older or female occupants. The first purpose of the analysis is to flag any safety technologies or vehicle components that have little benefit or possibly even increase harm to older occupants or women. The analysis did not raise any alarm flags for recent model vehicles. The major current safety technologies appear to be effective, but not necessarily equally effective for male and female adults of all age groups. However, seatbelts in the back seat are not as effective for passengers over age 70 as they are for young adults. Likewise, some obsolete safety technologies did not perform as well for older occupants as for young adults, such as two-point automatic seatbelts and some of the static energy-absorbing devices before they were supplemented with airbags. Also, older occupants and women, when belted, are at high risk of neck injury and frontal impacts of vehicles without airbags. A second purpose is to build a narrative of how fatality and injury risk of older occupants and women relative to young adult males has changed over the past 50 model years. Of course, it is important to note that in absolute terms, vehicles have become much safer for everybody. In the figure shown here, based on 2004 report, shows that the overall absolute occupant fatality risk decreased by 42% from calendar year 1955-1960 to calendar year 2002 due to increased belt use, airbags, and the other federal motor vehicle safety standards. The rising tide of safety benefited everyone. Absolute risk decreased substantially for males and females of all ages, but not necessarily by exactly equal amounts. If safety improvements help young people even more than they help the elderly, the relative gap between the elderly and the young can increase even while absolute safety improves for both. The general impression from the analysis of this report is that early safety technologies and design changes tended to benefit young adult males somewhat more than other groups, consequently augmenting slightly the relative risk increases for aging and for females. More recent technologies such as airbags, pretensioners, and load limiters, perhaps because they were developed with deeper understanding of biomechanics and human tolerance limits, have substantially reduced the excess risk of females relative to male occupants and might perhaps also be diminishing the relative risk increase associated with aging. However, these are mostly just tentative conclusions because the changes over time and the trends are small. Only the recent reduction in the fatality risk for women relative to men of the same age looks substantial. The third purpose is to identify specific injuries and injury sources that are especially prevalent among older occupants and/or females. It should be understood that these vulnerabilities are primarily a consequence of the intrinsic physiological differences between young and old people, males and females. They may be difficult to mitigate. Nevertheless, those injury mechanisms might be priority candidates for additional study of potential safety improvements. This report, of course, confirms the vulnerability of older occupants to thoracic injuries, especially multiple fractures, which has already been widely reported in the literature. Another key finding is that females are especially vulnerable to neck and abdominal injuries. At a lower injury level, women are quite vulnerable to leg fractures from the floor, toe pain and pedals, and to arm fractures from numerous sources. So that is the executive summary of that. And as I said, I will share that with you so you can read it in its entirety if you so wish. So now let's take a look at some pending legislation to potentially address these discrepancies. So we're going to talk about Bill S.161, which is titled She Develops Regulations in Vehicle Equality and Safety Act, or otherwise known as the She Drives Act. This bill directs the Department of Transportation to revise motor vehicle safety standards to require the use of certain test devices such as crash test dummies and testing on female crash test dummies. Specifically, DOT must issue final rules to revise the current testing regulations to include specific adult male and adult female frontal impact and side impact crash test dummies. The final rules must establish or update the testing injury criteria based on real-world injuries and the greater potential to increase safety. The injury criteria must include head, neck, chest, abdomen, pelvis, upper leg, and lower leg criteria for the crash test dummies. The final rules must also establish crashworthiness, frontal and side impact tests for adult female occupants in all front seating positions that are currently tested for adult male occupants as of the date of the bill's enactment. Further, DOT must promulgate a final decision notice to update the testing procedures for the new car assessment program of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to require the use of these crash test dummies for frontal and side impact crashworthiness testing. So let's discuss just a little bit more about this bill. So for decades, crash testing has mostly used male-based crash test dummies, and because of this, car safety systems are designed around male bodies. As a result, women are about 17% more likely to die in crashes and much more likely to be seriously injured. So this bill would require the government to use advanced female crash test dummies, not just scaled down males, include women in both front and rear seat testing, update safety standards using real-world injury data, and improve overall crash testing technology for everyone. So I think this bill is a good thing. Potentially, it could save many lives and reduce injuries, and it could also close a long-standing gender gap in vehicle safety. However, it has not passed yet. The current status of the act, it was reintroduced in January 2025 in the U.S. Senate. It passed out of committee, and it has been placed on the Senate legislative calendar, meaning it's eligible for a full Senate vote. So in order to pass, it would need to go through the full Senate vote, plus House approval, plus the signature of the president. This bill has bipartisan support, is backed by both Republicans and Democrats. So hopefully that will give it a better chance at passing. So why hasn't it passed yet? The thought is maybe Congress is dealing with higher priority or controversial legislation, time constraints in the legislative calendar, and it's a technical safety bill, which often moves slower unless there's public pressure. So, ladies, let's give them some public pressure, shall we? Reach out to your state representatives and see if we can get this bill passed. It would be a fabulous thing moving forward for women's safety. In addition, you can get online and check the safety information on the vehicle that you're currently driving. All that is available online. And of course, if you're considering purchasing a new vehicle, you may want to look at the safety ratings for the particular vehicles that you're considering, and that may be a part of your selection process. So that is all for the heavy stuff today. Let's move on to our product review. The product I'd like to tell you about today is, the name of the company is Kushae, Kushae. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. It's called Protective Feminine Skin Balm, and it says it was created by an OBGYN. So this is the product here, and of course I will link it down below so you can take a look at it if you like. So if you have areas of some chub rub going on, and this gets worse as the summer gets here. Summer's coming up. I live in a particularly warm area of the country, so I do tend to get those kind of red itchy rashes, where you're under your chest and different areas where your fat is rubbing together. If you have these, ladies, I did get this product. I used just a little bit of it, so I would think this jar would last you a really long time. I only had to use it once, and it got rid of everything. But you just rub it under there, and my rash disappeared. It was fantastic. So highly recommend this product. So again, I will link the product and all of these articles down below if you'd like to take a look at them. Thank you for watching today. And if you wouldn't mind, hit like and subscribe. It helps my brand new channel to grow. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.